there is a particular kind of responsibility that no job title fully captures. Head gardener. The word suggests soil under fingernails and early mornings, and the satisfying weight of a good pair of shears. They do not suggest the other things. The careful reading of sight lines, the memorization of which visitors linger too long at which gates, the knowledge that the ground you tend is not merely ground, that the walls around it exist for reasons that have nothing to do with keeping rabbits out of the flower beds. Margaret Calloway had held the title of head gardener at Kensington Palace for 11 years, and she had worked these grounds for 20 before that. 31 years of seasons. 31 years of knowing which roses bloomed early in a warm spring, which ones sulked after a late frost, which beds caught the afternoon light in a way that made visitors stop walking and simply stand. She knew this garden the way she knew her own hands, every scar, every stubborn patch, every small miracle that arrived, unbothered year after year, regardless of what the world outside the walls was doing. She also knew, on a morning like this one, cool, clear, the kind of May light that made everything look freshly painted, that knowing a garden well and controlling what happened inside it were two entirely different things. She checked her watch, 7:42. The visit was scheduled for 10. She went back to checking the rose beds and tried to feel as confident as she looked. The Sunken Garden at Kensington Palace does not announce itself. You walk along the broad path that borders the former grounds, and then the land simply drops away, and there it is, a rectangle of structured color sunk below the surrounding level, bordered by bleached lime trees and yew hedges that have been shaped and maintained for longer than most institutions have existed. In spring, the central beds are dense with tulips. By late May, as the tulips fade, the roses begin. Climbing roses on the brick pillars, hybrid teas in the former beds, the pale, almost luminous whites and creams that had been planted here since long before Margaret arrived, and that she fully expected to outlast her. It was a garden that had been tended through wars and coronations and funerals and celebrations. It had been photographed 10,000 times. It had made people cry, though they could rarely say exactly why. Margaret cared for it with the seriousness it deserved. This morning, the preparation had begun at 6. Tomas Reyes, her junior gardener, had arrived at 6:15 with coffee in a thermos and the quiet efficiency that had made him indispensable in the 3 years since she had taken him on. He was 28, the son of a landscape architect from Seville, and he had what Margaret privately considered the most important quality in a gardener. He listened to what the plants were telling him before he decided what to do with them. They had worked through the checklist together. All tools laid out on the central bench, child-safe snips, soft bristle brushes, a handled trowel with no sharp edges, the gravel paths raked, the central water feature checked for debris, the lime tree border assessed for any branches that might be at eye level for a small child moving at speed, which, Margaret had been advised, was the primary mode of locomotion for the subject of today's visit. Protection Officer Diana Ose had arrived at 7. She was 34, composed in the manner of someone who had decided at some point that composure was simply more efficient than its alternative, and she had walked the full perimeter of the Sunken Garden twice before accepting a cup of Tomas's coffee. She had pointed out 2 sight line adjustments, a section of hedge that needed a temporary privacy screen on the eastern path, a garden bench that should be repositioned to close an unobstructed angle from the public walkway above. Margaret had made both adjustments without comment. She had worked alongside protection officers for years. She understood that their job and her job were, at their root, the same job. Keep what matters safe. Make it look effortless. Go home at the end of the day with everything still intact. By 9:30, the garden was ready. Tomas was deadheading the first flush of climbing roses on the southern pillar. Margaret stood at the center of the space with her hands behind her back and looked at everything she and her team had built through the winter and early spring. The careful succession planting, the soil amendments, the 100 small decisions that added up to this. A garden in full, almost trembling readiness, the roses dazed from their absolute peak. She allowed herself, for approximately 45 seconds, to feel satisfied. Then she heard small, rapid footsteps on the gravel path above, and a voice carrying the particular bright confidence of a 6-year-old who has decided that today is going to be excellent. Prince Louis came down the steps into the Sunken Garden at a pace that suggested the steps were a minor inconvenience between him and whatever had caught his attention, which turned out to be the central bed of pale pink climbing roses on the eastern pillar. He stopped in front of them with his hands clasped behind his back in an unconscious echo of Margaret's own posture, tilted his head, and announced with complete authority, "Tomatoes." Tamaz, who was 3 feet away with a pair of shears, looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the climbing rose, a generous gardener, pale shell pink, fully fragrant, a variety she had personally selected and planted 6 years ago, and then looked back at Prince Louis. "Those are roses, Your Royal Highness," she said, with the same pleasant tone she used for everything. Louis considered this. He did not appear convinced. "They look like tomatoes," he said, in the manner of someone making a generous concession. "But okay." He moved on to the next bed, where a row of white hydrangeas bordered the former rose planting, bent down to examine them at extremely close range, and looked up at Margaret. "Garlic," he said. "Hydrangeas," Margaret said. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure." He straightened up, apparently deciding to table the matter for further review, and followed her toward the central beds where the deadheading demonstration was set up. Diana Ose had positioned herself near the garden steps, close enough, unobtrusive enough, present in the way that good protection officers were always present, which was to say that you were aware of her without being aware that you were aware of her. The morning was warm enough that the roses were beginning to release their scent properly. The light came down through the lime trees in long, even columns. Somewhere above the garden walls, the palace grounds were doing whatever they always did on a Tuesday morning in May: maintenance crews, administrative staff, the quiet machinery of an institution going about its business. Down here, there was a small boy in a blue jumper being introduced to the concept of deadheading. Margaret showed him the technique first on a fully spent bloom, the papery, browning petals, the way the head drooped on the stem, the clean angle of the cut that would encourage the plant to redirect its energy toward new growth rather than seed production. She explained it simply, in the terms she had developed over years of showing school groups through the gardens. "The flower has done its job," she said. "It bloomed, people saw it. Now it's tired. And if we leave it, the plant spends all its energy on this tired flower instead of making new ones. So we help it let go." Louis absorbed this with the focused, slightly frowning concentration he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. Then he held out his hand for the safety snips. "I'll help it let go," he said. Tamaz made a sound that was technically a cough. Margaret passed him the snips, guided his small hand to the correct angle on a spent bloom, a pale apricot tea rose that had peaked 3 days ago, and let him make the cut. The bloom came away cleanly. Louis held it up and examined it with enormous satisfaction. "I fixed it," he said. "You did," Margaret agreed. "That's called deadheading." "Deadheading," he repeated slowly, with great seriousness, apparently filing this away as information he intended to use. Then he looked at the bloom in his hand, then at Margaret. "Is the flower dead?" "It was already finished," she said. "We just helped the plant move on." He thought about this, like when my fish Gerald died and we put him in the garden. "Very similar," Margaret said, which was not entirely botanically accurate but felt like the right answer. He nodded, satisfied, and reached for the next spent bloom. For the next 20 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as Margaret had hoped. Louis worked along the rose bed with focused, if occasionally imprecise, enthusiasm. She redirected him twice away from buds that were not yet open, and once away from a bloom that was, in fact, perfectly healthy and did not need helping. He accepted all corrections with the same equanimity, asked a continuous stream of questions about why roses had thorns, to stop rabbits, he decided before she could answer, whether flowers could hear music. She said the research was ongoing, which was technically true, and whether the palace gardeners ever found anything interesting buried in the beds. She told him about the Victorian clay pipe Tomas had unearthed near the north border the previous autumn. And he looked at this information as though it was the best thing he had heard all year. Tomas was working the southern pillar, close enough to observe, far enough to give the visit its intended intimacy. Diana was at the steps. The garden was doing exactly what a garden in late May should do, being quietly, almost aggressively beautiful, in the way that required no assistance and acknowledged no audience. Margaret noticed the man at the perimeter at 9:57. He was standing on the public walkway that ran along the upper level of the Sunken Garden, the path where visitors stopped to look down into the formal beds, which was entirely normal, as people stopped there every day. What was not entirely normal was the camera. Not a phone, not a compact. A professional-grade mirrorless body with a telephoto lens that had no business being pointed at a garden where a member of the royal family was present, even for a scheduled, semi-private engagement. Margaret did not change her expression. She did not change her posture. She continued walking slowly along the rose bed beside Prince Louis, who was currently attempting to identify a variety called Darcy Bussell, a deep crimson, fully double bloom, utterly unlike a tomato in every conceivable way as a beetroot. Possible, she said. What else? Louis pressed his lips together in concentration. Maybe a very red cabbage. Interesting theory, Margaret said, and in her peripheral vision watched the man adjust his lens. She brought her left hand to her collar in a gesture that looked, to anyone watching, like she was straightening her jacket. It was not. It was the signal she and Diana had established during their pre-visit walkthrough. Diana, to her credit, acknowledged it with nothing more than a slight shift of weight and a casual turn of her head. The camera moved when Louis moved. That was the detail that mattered. A garden photographer, even a dedicated one with professional equipment, focuses on the garden. This lens tracked a 6-year-old child. Margaret kept her voice even, and her attention on the roses. "Your Royal Highness," she said, "would you like to choose which rose we deadhead next? You can be the one to decide which ones are ready." Louis took this responsibility with the gravity it deserved, clasping his hands behind his back again and walking along the bed with a critical squint that Margaret recognized, with a start, as an almost perfect imitation of what she did herself during her morning assessments. He stopped in front of a Gertrude gecko, the large, cupped pink blooms that were among the most loved varieties in the garden, and pointed at a bloom that was, in fact, just beginning to turn. "That one," he said, "it looks a bit tired." "Good eye," Margaret said and meant it. She glanced toward the perimeter. The man had not moved. He had been there, she calculated now, for 14 minutes. Tomas appeared at her elbow with the quiet, unannounced arrival of someone who had noticed what she had noticed. He bent to examine a stem near her feet with total apparent absorption and said, very quietly without looking up, "North corner, same man since we started the bed work." "I see him," Margaret said. "Press. No accreditation lanyard. No second camera, no kit bag." She paused, too still. Tomas nodded once and drifted back toward the southern pillar. Diana was moving, not toward the man, not yet. She was repositioning herself to a point that gave her a direct line to the perimeter steps while keeping Louis in her sight line. It was, Margaret thought, exactly the kind of movement that looked like nothing at all. Louis had found another tired bloom and was studying it with narrowed eyes. "This one is definitely finished," he announced. "It's very droopy. I think it needs the snips." "I think you're right," Margaret said. She passed him the safety snips and watched him make the cut, clean, correct angle. better than his first attempt, and felt, simultaneously, the ordinary pleasure of watching someone learn a thing and the steady, controlled attention of a woman keeping a 6-year-old child between herself and a camera she hadn't yet accounted for. The bloom came away. Louis held it up. 2, he said. I've done 2. Excellent, Margaret said. Shall we do a few more before we take a break? She moved him, gently and without apparent purpose, 3 steps to the left and slightly behind the central water feature, which broke the camera's direct sight line. It was the same principle as the rose beds. Sometimes you redirect the energy, and the plant never needs to know you did it. The man at the perimeter did not follow the movement, but he did not leave. Diana reached him 4 minutes later. Margaret knew the moment it happened because the camera came down. She did not look directly at the perimeter. She kept her full attention on Prince Louis, who had moved on to a bed of mixed floribundas and was currently arguing with considerable passion that a particularly round white bloom was probably an onion. But in her peripheral vision, she saw the lens drop from eye level, saw Diana's posture, saw the brief stillness that meant a conversation had started. Louis was explaining his onion theory in detail. The roundness, he said, gesturing at the bloom with the safety snips in a way that made Margaret gently redirect his hand. And the white. Onions are white. Some onions, Margaret said. Most onions, Louis said firmly. That's an iceberg rose, she said. One of the most famous white roses in the world. He looked at it for a long moment. It does look a bit like an iceberg, he conceded. More than an onion, maybe. High praise, said Tomas, from the southern pillar, and then turned back to his work before Louis could see him smiling. Margaret glanced once more at the perimeter. Diana was still in conversation. The man's body language had changed. The careful stillness of someone who had been purposeful had become something else. Smaller somehow. The camera hung at his side in both hands, and his shoulders had dropped in a way that Margaret, who had spent 31 years reading living things, recognized as the posture of someone who had just been surprised by their own emotion. She did not know yet what that meant. She returned her attention to the boy with the safety snips, who had identified a clematis growing along the garden wall as almost certainly broccoli, and filed the perimeter situation into things that were being handled. Diana came to her during the water break. Louis was sitting on the low garden bench with Tomas, eating the biscuits that had been packed in the visit kit and explaining, at length, a dream he'd had about a dragon who was also a postman. Tomas was listening with the full attention he gave to everything, asking questions about the dragon's route and whether it had a red uniform, and Louis was delighted. Diana appeared at Margaret's left shoulder. His name is David Carmichael, she said, in the quiet, level voice she used for everything that required actual attention. 67, retired school teacher, no press credentials, no connection to any accredited media organization. He says he came to film the roses. Margaret waited. His wife died in January, Diana continued. 40 years married. She visited this garden every spring. He says she came every year without fail for nearly 30 years. She had her own garden at their home in Richmond, named her roses after the varieties here. A pause. The Gertrude Jekyll, the generous gardener, the iceberg. Margaret looked at the rose beds. He didn't know there was a scheduled visit, Diana said. He comes on Tuesday mornings because she used to come on Tuesday mornings. He's been here every Tuesday since February. Another pause. Today he brought a camera because he said he wanted to be able to show her. Diana stopped, corrected herself quietly. He said he wanted to have something to look at in the evenings, of the roses she named. The garden was doing what gardens did in the silence between sentences, holding its light, releasing its scent, being completely indifferent to human grief in the way that was either cruel or comforting depending on the day. Margaret said, "Where is he now?" "I've asked him to wait at the upper bench. He understands that filming during a royal engagement isn't permitted and he's not contesting it. Diana paused for the first time with something that wasn't quite procedural. He's quite upset, not hostile, just grieving, Margaret said. Yes. From the bench, Louis's voice carried clearly across the garden. And the dragon had a very small bag, he was explaining to Tomas. Because dragons don't have a lot of letters, do they? Because of the fire. Tomas said he supposed that was true. Margaret stood for a moment in the way she stood when she was looking at a plant that needed something she hadn't yet identified. Then she said, I'll need 5 minutes with him. Can you manage that? Diana considered it. Within protocol. Within protocol, Margaret confirmed. I'm not suggesting anything that isn't within protocol. Diana looked at her for a moment with the assessing attention of someone whose entire professional value lay in reading situations accurately. Then she said, 5 minutes. I'll be present. Margaret approached Louis with the unhurried walk she used for everything in the garden. The same pace, whether she was crossing to check a struggling plant or delivering difficult news to a junior staff member. It was the walk of someone who had decided long ago that the speed of a thing did not change its nature. Your Royal Highness, she said, there's a gentleman sitting up on the bench above the garden. He comes here on Tuesday mornings because his wife loved these roses very much. Louis looked up from his biscuit. He had the quality, she had noticed, of going completely still when something interested him. The dragon postman story had been abandoned mid-sentence. Where is his wife? He asked. Margaret had worked with children in the garden for 20 years, school groups, family visits, the occasional very small person who had been brought along to a working day because childcare had fallen through. She had answered this question before, in different forms and different contexts. She answered it the same way she always answered it, which was to say, with the plain truth, in plain words, because children handled plain words better than careful constructions. She died, Margaret said, a few months ago. She used to come here every spring to see the roses, and he came today to take some photographs of them, so he could look at them at home. Louis was quiet for a moment. His biscuit remained in his hand, unfinished, which Margaret had learned was a reliable indicator of a child genuinely thinking rather than performing thought. Is he sad? Louis asked. I imagine he is, Margaret said. Louis looked at the rose beds. He looked at the bloom he had cut earlier, which was still sitting on the edge of the central bench, where he had placed it with some ceremony after his second successful deadheading. Can he come and look at them? He asked. The roses. He's going to stay on the upper bench, Margaret said, but I thought perhaps you might like to know that he's there. Louis nodded slowly, in the manner of someone incorporating information that required reorganizing. Then he looked at the cut bloom on the bench and back at Margaret and said, with the absolute certainty he applied to all his conclusions, whether botanical or otherwise, we should give him a flower. Tomas looked at the middle distance. Diana, standing 4 feet away, became very interested in the bleached lime trees. Margaret looked at Prince Louis, 6 years old, blue jumper, safety snip still in hand, looking at her with the straightforward expectation of someone who had identified the obvious solution and was waiting for the adults to catch up, and felt something that she would have struggled to name precisely, but that had something to do with the specific quality of a garden in May, which is that it keeps producing things regardless of whether you are ready for them. That, she said, is a very good idea. David Carmichael was sitting on the upper bench with his camera in his lap, and his hands folded over it in the way of someone who has recently been reminded that their presence has complicated things, and is sitting very carefully to avoid complicating them further. He was a tall man, gray hair, with the slightly rumpled quality of someone whose clothing had once been carefully chosen, and was now chosen by habit. He looked up when Margaret and Diana approached, and the expression on his face was the expression of a person who has prepared a sentence and is no longer sure it applies. Mr. Carmichael, Margaret said, I'm the head gardener. My name is Margaret Calloway. "I'm very sorry," he said immediately. "I genuinely didn't know I wouldn't have." "I know," Margaret said. "Diana has explained. I'm not here about the camera." He looked at her with the careful attention of someone recalibrating. Behind Margaret, at a distance that was proper and supervised, and within every applicable protocol, Prince Louis arrived at the top of the garden steps with Tamaz one pace behind him. He was holding the cut bloom, the apricot tea rose, his first successful deadhead, in both hands with the grave ceremony of someone carrying something that matters. He walked to the bench and held it out to David Carmichael. "This is from the garden," Louis said. "We cut it because it was finished flowering, but it's still a good flower. You can take it home." David Carmichael looked at the rose. He looked at it for long enough that the garden had time to do several things. Shift its light slightly as a cloud moved. Release a new current of scent from the central beds. Let it be complete most of its business with a nearby floribunda. "Thank you," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "What were your wife's roses called?" Louis asked. "The ones at your house." David Carmichael looked at the small boy in front of him with an expression that Margaret recognized from the garden. The expression of something that had been waiting for a particular season and had not, until this moment, been sure it would arrive. "Gertrude Jekyll," he said, "and one called Generous Gardener." She said the name suited it. A pause, and an iceberg by the back fence, white, very reliable. Louis nodded with deep seriousness. "I know the iceberg," he said. "It's down there. I thought it was an onion." David Carmichael made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh, small and surprised and real. "Margaret said it's very famous," Louis continued fairly, acknowledging the contrary evidence. "So probably not an onion." "Probably not," David agreed. Louis studied him for a moment with the focused attention he had given the roses. "Do you want to look at them?" he said. "From here you can see all of them. I can tell you which ones I did the deadheading on." Margaret and Diana exchanged a look that communicated, without words, a complete professional and human assessment of the situation, and arrived at the same answer. "From the bench," Margaret said. "We can look from the bench." He stayed for 11 minutes. Louis identified each rose bed from the upper path with the running commentary of a small person who has recently acquired knowledge and intends to use all of it. He pointed out his 2 deadheaded blooms with proprietary satisfaction. He explained the concept of deadheading to David Carmichael in terms that were not entirely botanically precise, but were, Margaret felt, emotionally accurate. He said that the flowers had done their job and were tired, and they were helping the plant let go and make new ones. David Carmichael listened to all of it. He held the apricot rose in both hands throughout. Before Diana indicated gently that the visit schedule needed to resume, David said to Margaret, "She would have," and then stopped and looked at the garden for a moment and said simply, "She loved it here." "People do," Margaret said. "It earns it." He nodded. He thanked Diana, who received it with professional warmth. He thanked Margaret, who received it with the same quiet directness with which she received most things. Louis was already back at the steps, looking down into the sunken garden with the assessing squint. "I think the red ones might need more deadheading," he called back to Margaret. "A few of them look quite tired." "We'll check when we get back down," Margaret said. Louis nodded and headed down the steps at the pace of someone who has work to do. The debrief took place in the small office adjacent to the head gardener's workshop, which smelled of compost and pencil shavings, and the particular dampwood smell of a room that had been heated and cooled by the seasons for more than a century. Diana walked through the incident with the thoroughness that Margaret had come to expect from her: perimeter assessment, response timeline, protocol adherence at each decision point. The camera situation would be logged. David Carmichael's access to the public walkway during a scheduled royal engagement would be noted as an area for procedural review. Future visit preparation would include a broader perimeter sweep of Tuesday morning regulars. Margaret listened to all of it and agreed with all of it. Then Diana set down her notebook and said, in a slightly different register, the bit with the flower. Within protocol, Margaret said. Completely within protocol, Diana agreed. I'm not questioning it. A pause. His Royal Highness initiated it. He did. He's 6, Diana said, with the tone of someone nodding something that required no further analysis, but that she was nodding anyway. He is, Margaret said. They sat with that for a moment. The Gertrude Jekyll is his wife's favorite, Diana said. He mentioned it twice. Margaret nodded. It's one of ours as well. Good in a late spring. Long flowering. She paused. When you log the incident, the camera, the perimeter matter, there's no need to include the last part in the security summary. That was a garden matter. Diana looked at her for a moment. Agreed, she said. Garden matter. After Diana left, Margaret sat alone in the office for a few minutes with a cup of tea she had made and mostly forgotten. Through the small window, she could see the edge of the sunken garden, the upper path where the bench sat empty now, the lime tree border catching the afternoon light. Neil Hartley from Palace Communications rang at 3 o'clock to discuss whether any element of the prince's visit might be suitable for a brief social release. A photograph, a caption, a note about the educational aspect. Margaret told him the visit had gone well and that she would have Tamaz send through some photographs of the rose beds, which could be used if appropriate, and that there was nothing further to report. He seemed satisfied with this. She hung up and sat with the quiet of the office, which was the particular quiet of a place where work had been done and people had left and the work itself remained. She went back to the garden at 6, when the day staff had gone and the palace grounds had settled into the long, still light of a May evening. She walked the rose beds the way she walked them every evening, slowly, with attention, not looking for anything specific, which was the only way to see what was actually there. The climbing, generous gardener on the southern pillar had 2 more blooms that were ready. She deadheaded them herself, barehanded without the shears, the way she did when she was alone and the evening was warm enough. The spent petals came away cleanly. She set them on the edge of the central bed and looked at the plant, the new buds already forming behind where the spent blooms had been, the stems redirecting their energy toward what came next. The garden did not require understanding. It required attention and consistency, and the willingness to help things let go when they were ready. 31 years. She had watched this garden hold the grief of a nation more than once, attended these same rose varieties through the long seasons when the palace was more a symbol than a home, and the crowds at the gates left flowers by the thousand, and the gardening staff had come in before dawn to manage what arrived overnight. She had watched the garden do what it always did through all of it, turn toward the light, produce its blooms, drop its petals, begin again. A man had come here every Tuesday morning since February. A boy of 6 had given him a flower and explained the philosophy of deadheading with perfect, accidental accuracy. She picked up the spent petals she had set aside and walked to the compost at the north border and returned them to the garden in the way the garden preferred, not wasted, just transformed, made into something that would eventually feed the next season's roots. The Gertrude Jekyll in the center bed was, as she had told Louis and as she had told no one else, at approximately 3 days from its absolute peak. Full, cupped, the deep pink that shifted toward rose gold in evening light, the scent released most strongly as the temperature dropped. She stood beside it for a while, without doing anything in particular. This was not in any job description. No protocol covered it. There was no procedure for standing in a garden in the evening and simply being present to it, for being, in whatever small and ordinary way, the person who noticed. But somebody had to. She had known that for 31 years, and she intended to know it for a good few more. The following Tuesday, there was no scheduled royal engagement in the Sunken Garden. David Carmichael came at his usual time with his camera. He stayed for 20 minutes. He photographed the Gertrude Jekyll, the generous gardener, and the iceberg by the south wall. He spoke briefly with Tamaz, who was working the east beds, and who showed him, without being asked, which blooms were at their peak that particular morning. He came the Tuesday after that as well. Margaret arranged, through channels that required no official documentation, for him to be added to the weekly visitor register as a garden supporter, a category that existed primarily for horticultural researchers and donor family members, and that granted access to the public walkway during morning maintenance hours. It was, as she noted in no report filed anywhere, a garden matter.